Isaiah. The 16th chapter deals with the destruction of Moab because of their pride and arrogance. Excuse me. We'd gotten down to verse 13, and verses 13 and 14 I titled as the time involved in the destruction of Moab's glory. And so in verse 13 he says, the word that the Lord hath spoken concerning Moab since that time. But now the Lord hath spoken, well, that's verse 14, but from verse 13 we see that this prophecy that Isaiah is giving concerning Moab's destruction is not new. The thing is, though, that God has spoken concerning Moab since that time. What would that time be? Well, it's generally considered that these prophecies about Moab's destruction have been spoken since Moab wrote the Pentateuch. Since Moses wrote the Pentateuch. The Pentateuch, of course, being the first 5 books of the Old Testament. So it's basically been since that time that Moab's going to be destroyed. In what we have seen in Isaiah 16, it's not been a specific quote of any of those previous prophecies. But basically what Isaiah is doing is giving a summary of them, giving the substance of those prophecies. A lot of times when we're dealing with things in the Bible, we might not give an exact quotation, but we give a summation or a substance of what it says. And that's what Isaiah seems to be doing. But we also learn that, and here's an aspect of inspiration. While the prophecies had been given, they were not man's prophecies, they were God's prophecies. This is the word that the Lord hath spoken. Well, we could ask, how did he do that? Did he do it directly? Did a voice out of heaven come out and say these things? Well, no. He did it indirectly. He did it through the prophets. And that would be inclusive of Moses, as Moses also was a prophet. So that's inspiration, that God is the one doing the speaking, but he's using man's mouth or man's writings when you're dealing with the written word. We might make the parallel to today. Does God speak to us today? Yes, of course he does. He's doing it now. How does he do it, though? Okay, through his word. He does it indirectly. You have direct action, you have indirect action. He does it indirectly. He doesn't. Now then, in relationship to the apostles, the prophets of the Old Testament, the New Testament apostles and prophets, He did it directly with them. If you, and we won't go over there and read it, but Galatians 1, 10 and 11, Paul talks about he received his message directly from God. But in writing to the Ephesians, he said, when you read it, you can have my understanding. Well, where'd that understanding come from? It came directly from God to him. When they read what he wrote, they would have that same understanding. That's inspiration. Okay, Dale.
He doesn't cause the earth to swallow people up like in number 16, but he does tell us through the word that in hell the rich man lift up his eyes, being in torment, that Hades will swallow people up that die unprepared. So you could say the sword of the Spirit tells you that the same thing happened in number 16 could happen again. If you die unprepared, Christ finds you unprepared when he comes in the clouds. You know, and you can
Okay, it took me a while to see the connection you were trying to make. Well, some people say I'm rather wordy at times, but I know none of y'all would. The likeness in God acted directly in relationship to Korah, Dathan, and Abiram in opening up the earth and swallowing them up. That's the idea that you're saying forth in someone who's not prepared. Hades will, or Tartarus will open up and swallow them, but that's not, you're saying, direct action.
God used 70 that went out whenever they sent them 2 by 2 out. He talked straightly through them. They just started talking, but they wouldn't say it. God was saying using them that say it.
In is it Matthew 10:13, I believe? Matthew 10, 19, and 20, you saying? But the idea is that it's not you that's speaking, but it's the Holy Spirit speaking through you. And thus they would not need to premeditate or think about it beforehand, what they were going to say. Certainly would be nice to have that ability today, but people don't, even though they claim it. Since we've gotten off onto this subject a little bit, John 14, 25 and 26, and John 16, 12 and 13. Both of those passages say that the Holy Spirit is going to guide them into all truth. People today, especially in the denominational world, some in the church even, are saying those things apply to us. Then they don't need to study. They can never be wrong about anything because they have all truth.
That's what the Pope claims.
Pope claims that, but yeah. But they will not accept the consequences of what they say. They say this applies to us. They have all truth, therefore. Nothing that they say can ever be wrong. Ask yourself the question, could the apostles have taught error in speaking by the Holy Spirit? Could they have written error? No, because they were inspired and it was God speaking through them. Thus, in those passages, John chapters 14, 15, and 16 specifically apply to the apostles, not to us. They only apply to us in, if at all, in an indirect way. And what I mean by that is when there's some other passage over here that teaches that in application to us. For example, give an illustration, John 14 and verse 27. He says, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give unto you, not as the world giveth, give I unto you. Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid." Was that only for the apostles? No. How do I know that? Because I can turn over, for example, to Philippians 4, and I find the same teaching in relationship to us. So I know that which he said to them was a general application, even though he's speaking specifically to them. Now then, when we look at John 14, 25 and 26, and John 16, 12 and 13, and those things that I will bring all things to your remembrance, I'll show you things to come, you shall be able to speak all truth. Those things were specific to them. They're not applied to anyone else today. But if it was, then that person would be inspired and nothing he said would be wrong. Actually, it's more specific than that. King James just says once delivered unto the saints. It is literally one time for all time. Once for all delivered unto the saints. That's why some individuals, for example, will state or have argued that Jude was the last book written because of that statement. Once for all. It had been completed. And Jude was the last book that was thus completed. Now, and I'm not saying I hold that view. I'm just saying there are some who argue such because of that passage. But yes, it was once for all delivered. Not to be, it doesn't need us today to add to it or change it or alter it or supplement it or anything else. We have, when we read what they wrote, we can have their understanding, and that goes back to, again, Ephesians 3, verses 4 and 5. Or 3, 4, and 5. Dale, you want to...
And the things that God heard of me, talking to Timothy, among many witnesses, the same commit to faithful men who shall be able to teach others also. We're not supposed to teach contradictory doctrines to what they taught, because otherwise we wouldn't be committing.
You wouldn't be committing that word to them. So, you see the same principle here. This is not Isaiah's prophecy. The prophecies that went before were not those men's prophecies, or those prophets' prophecy. It was God's. And he was using them as a mouthpiece to speak through them. But you see that very clearly here, the word that the Lord has spoken, not that the prophet spoke. Now then, in verse 14, he goes on, But now the Lord has spoken, saying, within 3 years, as the years of hireling, and the glory of Moab shall be contemned with all that great multitude, and the remnant shall be very small and feeble. So here we have something that is in addition to what we've had before. Other prophecies dealing with Moab had not given a specific time frame. Isaiah, though, gives a specific time frame. 3 years. That's it. And Moab would be destroyed. He likens it, though, to 3 years of a hireling. Well, what is a hireling thus? Hireling was someone who hired himself out, I'll put it that way, to someone for a certain time frame. Basically became an indentured servant. Some people don't see the difference between an indentured servant and a slave, but there is a difference. An indentured servant has a certain time frame. A slave does not. There's a certain time frame. He becomes an indentured servant to that individual for that time frame. That time frame could not be changed or altered. Couldn't be added to, couldn't be taken away from. It was that time frame, and that time frame only. To use an illustration, I'm going to become Jason's slave for 3 years. Forget about it. It's not going to happen. But a year into it, Jason can say, well, if 3 years isn't enough, we're going to make it 4 years. Can't do it. The time frame is set, that's it. So when God said it's within 3 years as the years of a hireling, he is saying that time frame is set. It cannot be changed or altered. So within that time frame, this is going to happen. But the question now that we come to with this is, when was this stated? And in reality, we don't know. So we don't know the beginning point of this statement of 3 years, or within 3 years.
Does that mean we don't know the date that Moab got destroyed?
It's saying that we don't know when Isaiah gave the prophecy. It could have been being fulfilled in the time of Tiglath-Pileser's invasion. If you turn over, for example, to 1 Chronicles 5 and verse 26, it says, and the God of Israel stirred up the spirit of Pul. Pul is the shortened name to Tiglath-Pileser III. So the God of Israel stirred up the spirit of Pul, king of Assyria, and the spirit of Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria. And he carried them away, even the Reubenites and the Gadites and the half-tribe of Manasseh, and brought them unto Halah and Habor and Hair, and to the river Gozan until this day. Well, that's showing that Tiglath-Pileser had that control of that area of Moab. So it could be during that time frame of his invasion. It could have been also the time of Shalmaneser, Sargon, or Sennacherib. In 2 Kings 18 and verse 13, it talks about, now in the 14th year of King Hezekiah did Sennacherib, king of Assyria, come up against all the fenced cities of Judah and took them. So it could be that time frame. We don't know. But we do know that that which Moab gloried in is going to be turned to shame, and the Moabites are going to be very small and weak or feeble. They're just basically nothing. If you go over to that area today and you ask to go to the nation of the Moabites, where will you go? I'm not going to go any place because there's not any. Well, the point I'm making is they cease to exist as a nation. They have no land. They don't have a people. They just don't exist. That's the point I was making, Dale. Yes, at this time, and they did continue on for a while, but they were small and very small and feeble. Okay, chapter 17. Well, Chapter 17 is going to be the burden of Damascus, dealing with us, the nation, or the city of Damascus. And it actually, in verses 1 through 3, is going to deal with the destruction of Damascus and Ephraim. Now, I did bring up a map of this area. Down here, if I can get you'll see Jerusalem in that area there. Maybe you can see that at the bottom. And then way up here is Damascus. So there's where Damascus is. Damascus, it says, the burden of Damascus, behold, Damascus is taken away from being a city, and it shall be a ruinous heap. Get back over here. Damascus is the capital of Syria, and it was the oldest city in the world, and during Isaiah's time was the confederate of the northern kingdom of Israel. They probably, at the time that Isaiah is being written, were the strongest nation or most powerful nation in the world at the time. What nation finally defeated them? Not Babylonians. It would be the Assyrians, that's right. So remember the difference between Syria and Assyria. The Assyrians defeated the Syrians. And while Damascus was the capital of Syria, what city was the capital of the Assyrians? Nineveh was the capital of Assyria. Who then defeated the Assyrians to become the world power? No. Babylonians. And then, after that, you have the Medo-Persian Empire. Now then, if you remember, I went through that for a reason, not just to remind you of the history, but when Isaiah writes, the Syrians are the world, the most powerful nation. In Isaiah's prophecies, he prophesies about not just the Syria, not just about the Assyrians, but also the Babylonians, and then the Medo-Persians. And if you remember, Isaiah mentions a specific king of the Medo-Persian Empire who was Cyrus the Great. and says that Cyrus is going to be basically his instrument in releasing the Israelites to go back to Jerusalem. And first you have them returning to the city. Later on there is the rebuilding of the temple. And then at the third return from Babylonian captivity, you have the rebuilding of the walls of the city. So there's 3 returns, even as there was 3 carrying aways. But also, Isaiah mentions the downfall of the Medo-Persians as well. So you think about it. Here he is writing during this period of the time of Syria. And he's talking about kingdoms way down the line that basically aren't even considered. They're nothing. Now then, the only answer to that is the inspiration of God. By name. About give or take 150 years in the future. Can you imagine someone in basically 1850 mentioning your name by talking about you and what you're going to do? Yeah, who's going to be president there? Will there even be a nation of the United States of America at that time? That's an amazing prophecy. Now then, the liberals and modernists of our day try to offset that, and when we introduced the book, we went through a Deutero and Trito Isaiah, in which they divide the book up, and they will essentially say these prophecies that are way in the future, they're not really prophecies because Isaiah didn't write it. It was written by somebody else, and then they were compiled together into one book and given Isaiah's name. Well, that type of nonsense was not even considered until the 1800s, basically. So, and the discoveries that we have made through time have debunked that theory, those theories, even though it still remains popular. But you might ask yourself, what else can they do? How else can you explain it? Daniel, for example, is another book just like that. There is, we're insulated from a lot of this because we don't get involved in them, in these matters, but there is a huge debate that went on, and it's continuing, as to the dating of Daniel. Because he writes so precisely as what's going to happen that he could not have written when he wrote it, because it's too precise. There's too much detail. And so he had to write it after the fact, which means you have to date it at a different time frame. Well, that's what you come down to. It's to avoid inspiration. God didn't inspire this. They wrote by their own knowledge and their own wisdom. And the only thing is, they wrote it at a much later date, when all of these things had already happened, and they're writing in reality history. And there's no predictive prophecy in it. Okay, Dale.
Christ and Nazareth quotes from Isaiah 61. Philip quotes from Isaiah 53. And
So?
2, 44 or 28 or wherever it is, quote.
Does
In principle, Isaiah 2, 1 through 3, and so all of them are quoting them all, sprinkled all over the place.
That doesn't prove anything, though. Dan.
Right, sure.
It doesn't. Because
Turn you into a pretzel if I explain.
No, it's very simple. Yes, Jesus quoted from them, but they wrote, for example, let's just say 200 BC, not 700 BC. Where did he say that they wrote back then? He didn't. That's the problem with just saying Jesus quoted them. Okay, Jesus quoted them. Doesn't prove that they wrote when we have it dated.
They're a bunch of assertion and allegations, all they are, and they don't.
Well, no, it becomes a matter of setting down the evidence and proving that they wrote it at the time in which we have dated it. And that goes into another entire study. But I introduced all that to show Isaiah is writing by inspiration, but also here Damascus, and to continue to recognize the difference between Syria and Assyria, the two different nations. But this passage also kind of reminds us of Isaiah chapter 7 and what Ahab was concerned about. And here he's saying basically Damascus is taken away and going to be a ruinous heap. Damascus is going to be totally destroyed, in other words. Just a heap out there of stones and nothingness. So that's what's going to happen to Damascus. In verse 2 then, the cities of Or are forsaken. They shall be for flocks, which shall lie down, and none shall make them afraid. The cities around this Aurora and under its jurisdiction would be a place where flocks would now graze, as opposed to the cities that were existing there at that time. And he adds basically that none, that is, the people, the inhabitants, would not make the animals afraid. Generally speaking, I'm saying generally, not dealing specifically with any one class of animal, but generally speaking, animals are afraid of humans because they don't have contact with humans. Now, if you have a lot of contact with them, then that fear goes away. But
That's the way it is in the Galapagos. You can walk all over the wild animals because there's no humans. Never had. They don't.
that's true. Any place where humans have not gone, are not there all the time. Animals, you go there, animals will run from you because they're not familiar with you. They don't know anything. Well, now then you take that idea to this. The flocks are going to be lying down there. Humans aren't going to make them afraid. Humans aren't going to do anything to them. They have no fear. Jamieson, Fawcett, and Brown, in their commentary, wrote this, that Aurora was near Rabhaman at the river of Gad, an arm of the Jabbok, which 2 Samuel 24 and verse 5, founded by the Gadites, Numbers 32 and verse 34. The Gadites would be the tribe of Gad. So this is basically a city that was founded by the tribe of Gad. Pulpit commentary stated, now Sargon's animals, or got animals on my mind. Sargon's annals tell us of Gargar, a name well expressing the Hebrew, which was united in a league with Damascus, Samaria, Arpad, and Simurah in the second year of Sargon, and was the scene of a great battle and a great destruction. Sargon besieged it, took it, and reduced it to ashes. There is every reason to recognize this aurora of this verse in the Gargar of Sargon's inscriptions. So Sargon, in his annals, the inscriptions that he has a passage talking about this city of Gargar, that there was a great battle, great destruction. He besieged it, he took it, reduced it to ashes. And pulpit commentary is saying that Gargar that's in his annals is this city. Dale.
The words of Amos, who was concerning Israel in the days of Uzziah, who Isaiah mentions in Isaiah 1, verse 1 and 3, for 3 transgressions of the masters and 4 punishments, etc. They threshed Gilead with iron implements. Then I will send a fire in the Hazael's house, and the houses of Ben-Hadad, and then I will break the bar of Damascus, cut off the inhabitants of the valley of Avon, and he goes on Beth Eden and Kerr and a bunch of other places around, not far from Aurora.
Okay. It's that entire area. In verse 3 then, the fortress also shall cease from Ephraim, and the kingdom from Damascus, and and the remnant of Syria, they shall be as the glory of the children of Israel, saith the Lord of hosts. So now then we have the northern kingdom of Ephraim. The northern kingdom is referred to as the northern kingdom. Sometimes it's referred to as Israel. Sometimes it's referred to as Ephraim. So doesn't matter which name it's dealing with. It was called Ephraim because Ephraim was the largest of the tribes of the northern kingdom. And so Ephraim might refer to the tribe of Ephraim. Ephraim might refer to the northern kingdom. Kind of like Israel, pre-division, in other words, pre-Rehoboam, before Rehoboam's time, Israel referred to the entirety of the people. After Rehoboam's time, Israel referred to the northern kingdom, but not the southern kingdom, which was Judah. So here Ephraim is mentioned, and they are going to receive the same judgment as her ally Syria. Tiglath-Pileser destroyed Syria, or Damascus, in 732 BC. They reasserted their independence in 721 BC, and then in 720 BC were destroyed again. Shalmaneser destroyed Samaria in 722 BC, although it's Sargon that takes credit for it as destroying it in the first year of his reign. Both nations that are mentioned here, Ephraim and Damascus, the kingdom of Damascus, the remnant of Syria, they're going to share in the same glory, and that glory is going to be captivity. That's the glory that they have to look forward to. Instead of going into verse 4, we'll stop at that verse, and since there's only about a minute or so left before Andrew rings that second bell.